Good Friday afternoon. Thanks for joining us on KARE 11 News Now. I'm Chris Harabsky. Today in St. Paul, 30 Democratic lawmakers hearing testimony from the community on the impact of immigration enforcement here in the Twin Cities. It is the sixth hearing like this in a series that is called Kidnapped and Disappeared. We're going to play you some of that testimony now.
This administration claims this surge brings security and safety, but at the same time, federal officers are operating around hospitals, schools, and places of worship, spaces that should be protected, not militarized. These actions create fear, disrupt possession services, and send shockwaves far beyond a single arrest.
Recently, we had an officer who was waved down by a motorist on a busy street. By the time the officer was in position to contact the driver, ICE agents pulled up and began ordering the driver from the vehicle. Per our policy, our officer did not assist or obstruct, but it gave the impression that the officer was working with ICE, and it has led to anger and confusion from our community and from the officer involved.
Citizens, observers, protesters, Minnesotans are rightfully upset about what they're seeing. Seeing people murdered, they're seeing people shot at, they're seeing people dragged from their homes and from cars, and they're coming out. For the most part, what we're seeing is escalation from DHS forces.
Yeah.
We have a team now that's at that hearing today. Make sure you tune in at KARE 11 News at 4, 5, and 6 for full coverage of the hearing. On the state level, Attorney General Keith Ellison has launched a form that people can fill out detailing their interactions with federal agents. The goal of that, he says, is to build a case against ICE. Republican leaders, on the other hand, criticizing statements from local leaders accusing them of fanning the flames.
No, we're working through all these issues, but I can tell you Minnesota is out of control. You have local and state leaders who seem to be encouraging violence and all of this madness, and the president's frustrated about it, and so are we.
The president not responding directly to the hearing today, but posting this on Truth Social saying, without evidence, that, quote, troublemakers, agitators, and insurrectionists are in many cases highly paid professionals, end quote. Then he says the governor and mayor, seemingly talking about Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, have totally lost control, he says. He goes on to say that if he is forced to act, he will, quote, and it, again, probably referring to protests against ICE activity, will be solved quickly and effectively. Here's Governor Tim Walz's most recent statement about what is happening in Minnesota. He says, quote, I am making a direct appeal to the president. Let's turn the temperature down. Stop this campaign of retribution. This is not who we are. And an appeal to Minnesotans. I know this is scary. We must speak out loudly, urgently, but also peacefully. We cannot fan the flames of chaos. That's what he wants, end quote. The president is threatening to impose the Insurrection Act on Minnesota if protests get out of hand. The Insurrection Act gives the president broad power to deploy the military inside the United States to suppress a rebellion or to enforce the law in a state that opposes or obstructs the execution of federal law. It was last invoked in 1992 after riots broke out in Los Angeles following the acquittal of 4 police officers in the beating of Rodney King. But in that, in nearly every other case, the military was requested by the state. Last time it happened against the wishes of a state was during the 1965 Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. But the military was there to protect the constitutional rights of citizens. That makes it very different than the situation unfolding in Minnesota, meaning we are in uncharted waters. Kent Erdahl explains what that could mean and what history can tell us about it.
The key to all of this is that because the insurrection clause hasn't really ever been interpreted by courts of law, and that then gives this current president wide latitude to say, this is an insurrection, I want to invoke this act.
If the Insurrection Act is invoked, can the troops coming in do more than they could on the ground, say, in California this summer, where they could just only kind of like protect buildings and things?
That's absolutely right. And they will absolutely be able to go in and put down even nonviolent protests. If ICE is making the argument that those nonviolent protests are impeding their ability to get their job done, then if the insurrection clause is enacted, the assumption would be that the military or the militia could come in and make sure that people are not out on the streets protesting at all.
The president has certainly threatened to use it several times already. but he hasn't. Why do you think that is? And do you think that this time might be any different?
So I would suspect that the president is getting advice from military advisors who say, if you take that next step, that is another step towards what could be martial law, whether that's in one particular city, one particular state, or the entire United States. And that's not a road a president wants to go down. The reason this might be different is that every single time the administration is ratcheting up how many ICE agents are surrounding the greater Twin Cities area, as well as the entire state of Minnesota, the other side, the protesters and those who are watching ICE, are ratcheting up their game as well. And I don't mean that they're ratcheting up their game by causing violence or trying to harm ICE agents. The protests are just growing larger. And so it's almost this game of chicken. And if that game of chicken goes far enough, I could see that this might be the time the president would really invoke that clause.
Kent Erdahl reporting there. If the president does invoke the Insurrection Act, we already know the courts will be asked to get involved, with Attorney General Keith Ellison saying that he's prepared to challenge it in court. Meantime, we're still seeing clashes between protesters and law enforcement at the Whipple building that's near Fort Snelling. DHS saying today they arrested at least 12 people last night. We're also learning today that now there are roughly 3,000 federal immigration officers in the Minneapolis area. That's about 5 times the size of the Minneapolis Police Department. And today we're learning more about another person shot by a federal law enforcement officer. This situation happened on Wednesday night. Here's what the Department of Homeland Security says leading up to that shooting. According to DHS, Julio Cesar Sosa Celis is in the U.S. illegally from Venezuela. While officers were trying to arrest him during a targeted traffic stop, he drove off. He crashed his vehicle into another parked car, they say, and that's when he took off on foot. DHS says the officer eventually caught up to him, and that's when some type of struggle began. DHS says during the struggle, 2 other men came out of a home nearby and ambushed the officer, attacking him with a shovel and a broom. And that is when the officer shot Sosa Celis in the leg. Officials say both the officer and Sosa Celis were hospitalized. The 2 other men are also in custody. This afternoon, we have new details into the newsroom from the shooting that killed 37-year-old Renee Good last week. The details coming from the 911 transcripts and incident reports that are shedding light on what happened in the moments after she was shot by a federal agent. Those recordings include a call from an ICE agent reporting shots fired and saying officers were, quote, stuck in a vehicle, end quote, and confronted by, quote, agitators. Multiple calls from witnesses urgently pleading for help at the scene. MFD, so that's the fire department, Minneapolis Fire Department's report states, Renee Good was found unresponsive in her car, not breathing, with irregular pulse activity. Emergency medical services workers found Good with 2 apparent gunshot wounds to the chest, 1 apparent gunshot wound, quote unquote, to the left forearm, and, quote, a possible gunshot wound, end quote, on the left side of the head. We read EMS workers had to move her to the sidewalk to, quote, get separation from an escalating scene involving law enforcement and bystanders, end quote. They started and continued CPR before medics brought her to the hospital. We're also hearing from the attorney representing Renee Good's family, civil rights lawyer Antonio Ramanucci, his firm, same one that represented George Floyd's family, saying it will pursue accountability on behalf of her loved ones.
There are no criminal charges brought. This is a civil case which seeks recompense, which means money damages if it's determined that that's what's warranted. And so we have to gather an investigation much like any other investigation. We want to talk to people. We want to gather video evidence. We want to see trajectory analysis. We'd like to see the vehicle.
Romanucci is also pushing back against what he calls false and defamatory online reports that have circulated about Renee Good's background. He says Good and her partner Becca have no criminal or felony history beyond minor traffic citations. As this story develops, you can find our continuing coverage on air, online, and streaming right here on KARE 11+. We are just months away from the Minnesota gubernatorial election, and last night, 11 Republican candidates for governor faced off in a debate. That debate spanned topics including public safety, education, mining, and health care. but much of it focused on fraud and fraud allegations that has put Minnesota in the national spotlight again in the last few months.
When I became Speaker in January, I established the Fraud Prevention and Agency Oversight Committee, requiring that it would have a sole Republican chair and a Republican majority for the entire 2 years.
We need to make sure that our employees are doing the correct thing. And if they're not, they get fired. If they're fudging documents, they get fired.
The debate was hosted by the Scott County Republican Party and lasted about 2 hours. Other candidates in attendance included Scott Jensen, Brad Kohler, and Mike Lindell. For the first time, we're hearing from the family of John Tongson, who was stabbed to death in his St. Anthony apartment building over the weekend. Today, John's cousin saying that he's a hero who died protecting his stepchildren. Joe McCoy shows us how he's being remembered.
The word hero has a tendency to get thrown around a lot.
He loved his family. He loved his extended family, his kids.
But John Tongson truly was one.
John was my cousin.
Blake Tongson says it was never a question that John loved his stepkids as much as his biological kids. On Saturday, John made the ultimate sacrifice for them.
Something he probably didn't think 2 seconds about. I think he just did it because it's part of who he is.
According to court documents, early Saturday morning, John and his 2 stepkids heard sawing noises in the hallway outside John's apartment at the Equinox Apartments in St. Anthony. John and his 15-year-old stepson went into the hall where they were attacked by John's neighbor, Jonathan Kaupa. Charging documents say Kaupa stabbed the stepson 20 times with a screwdriver-like object. Tongson pulled Kaupa off his stepson, who fled into the apartment, and Kaupa stabbed Tongson to death.
Really, his last kind of final act here on Earth was him being a hero and saving his stepkids.
Court documents say Kaupa fled the scene but was arrested later in the day in Hinckley. Kaupa's father told police that he did not know his son to be violent, but that he suffers from mental health issues and had been hospitalized twice for mental health crises. Blake remembers his cousin for his love for Minnesota sports, contagious laugh, huge heart, and desire to always help others.
If you were stranded in outside in a Minnesota winter, he'd give you the shirt off his back.
A real-life hero whose stepson is now out of the hospital because of him.
He should absolutely be remembered that way because he made the ultimate sacrifice for those stepkids.
Wow. Joe McCoy reporting there. The charges did not offer any motive for the stabbing. Kaupa's facing charges of second-degree murder and attempted second-degree murder. Stick with us. We got more news and weather. It's coming up after the break.